For 20 years, I let her laugh at my rust-spotted Buick while she called me broke dad in front of everyone. I smiled through the humiliation at every family gathering as my stepdaughter mocked my hand-ironed shirts and discount cologne. What she never knew was why I drove that old car despite having millions hidden away, a secret I kept locked behind a rusted gate that no one had opened since 1996. Then came that rainy night when she called me, stranded on the highway with her newborn son, abandoned by her husband who'd emptied their accounts and disappeared with his secretary. As I pulled up in my embarrassing old car to rescue her, I finally had to decide. Was it time to reveal what her mother had made me promise to keep hidden until she was ready to see beyond appearances? The truth would change everything, but some lessons can only be learned when you've lost everything else first. If this story touched your heart, make sure to follow the channel for more emotional true stories that will make you rethink what really matters in life. Like and comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what part of this story resonated with you most. Her laugh still echoes in my ears after all these years. That high-pitched, deliberate laugh that would rise above everyone else's, always in front of the whole family. Every single time I pulled up in my old Buick to those fancy Sunday dinners, my stepdaughter would make sure everyone heard her. "Look, everyone, the last century's Uber has arrived." And they would all laugh. I laughed too. But inside, I was bleeding. It wasn't just the car she mocked, it was me. My weathered hands, my discount store cologne, my hand-ironed shirts that I'd pressed the night before, making sure every wrinkle was gone. The simple casserole dishes I'd bring that were never sophisticated enough for their gatherings at Thompson Ridge, where the neighbors were doctors and tech executives. Even after I sold my house, the one I had spent 30 years paying off, to cover her mother's cancer treatments when the insurance company denied the claim, she never once called me dad. Not when I walked her down the aisle at that $50,000 wedding her biological father didn't bother to attend. Not when she needed someone to co-sign for her first apartment in Boston. To her, I was always Mom's broke husband or the old man from the garage. I remember the Christmas of 2015. Everyone had gathered at her new house in Connecticut. She had just gotten a promotion at her marketing firm, and the place was like something out of those magazines my wife used to read before she got sick. When I arrived, my stepdaughter stepped onto the porch, glass of wine in hand, and loudly announced, "Oh my God, you're still driving that thing? I thought it would have died by now." Just like... She stopped herself, but I knew what she was going to say. "Just like your mother. Just like my wife." The silence that fell over the porch was heavier than any snowfall I'd ever shoveled. Her husband looked away, embarrassed. Her cousin nearly choked on her eggnog. But I just smiled and handed her the gift I'd wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, because I couldn't afford the fancy paper with the reindeers on it. There's something about being invisible that changes a man. You start noticing things others don't. You see how people behave when they think nobody important is watching. Like how my stepdaughter's husband would sneak glances at his phone whenever she left the room. Or how her perfect friends would roll their eyes behind her back when she bragged about her European vacations. But there's one thing she never knew. And that's why I'm telling this story now. Because on that rainy Thursday last November, when she was stranded on Highway 27 with a newborn baby in her arms, no battery on her phone, no cash in her wallet, and nobody to call, there was only one number she remembered by heart: mine. And it was on that day when I pulled up in my 20-year-old Buick with the rust spots and the noisy muffler, that she finally saw the garage I'd kept hidden for more than 3 decades. You see, there's a reason I never bought a new car despite having enough money. There's a reason I wore the same 5 shirts in rotation for years. There's a reason I lived in that small house on Oak Street long after I could have moved to something bigger. Some secrets are worth keeping, not out of spite, but because timing is everything. And sometimes the people who need to learn the most important lessons are the ones who think they already know everything. As I turned into her mother's old driveway that rainy afternoon, with her clutching that tiny baby to her chest, I saw something I hadn't seen in 15 years: humility in her eyes. That's when I knew it was finally time to show her what was behind that rusty garage door that nobody had ever been allowed to open. Some people collect stamps. Some collect coins. Me? I collected something else entirely. And the look on her face when that door slowly creaked open was worth every single mockery I had endured for the past 20 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning to understand why a man would choose to be ridiculed rather than reveal the truth. Because sometimes the lessons we need to teach those we love require more patience than most people are willing to give. The call came at 4:37 p.m. on a Thursday. I remember because I was watching that old game show I've followed for 20 years, just about to see if the contestant would risk it all on the final question. The phone vibrated against my wooden coffee table, the one Martha and I had picked up at a yard sale back in '92. I almost didn't answer. These days, most calls are just people trying to sell you something or scam you out of your savings. But something made me reach for it. Maybe it was the way it vibrated. Urgent, insistent, like it knew something I didn't. Her voice came through as a whisper, almost unrecognizable. "It's me. I need help." The tremor in her voice was unmistakable, but there was no apology in it, just raw necessity. Elizabeth was stranded on Route 50, that long stretch of highway where cell reception dips in and out like a lazy swimmer. She had her 3-week-old baby, Jacob, with her. No formula, no diapers, nothing but the clothes on their backs and a car that wouldn't start. Her husband, Richard, the investment banker with the German sports car and the wandering eye, had left her for his administrative assistant. Took their car too. A temporary arrangement, he'd called it in the note he left. The kind of temporary that comes with packed suitcases and empty joint accounts. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? That I wasn't surprised? That I had seen the way he looked at his phone during Christmas dinner? That I had noticed how he never seemed to hold little Jacob, always finding an excuse to pass him back to Elizabeth? Instead, I just hung up and grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, the same hook where Martha's keys used to hang next to mine. The rain was coming down in sheets as I backed out of the driveway. My windshield wipers, I'd been meaning to replace them, smeared more than cleared, creating watery rainbows under the streetlights. I turned on the radio, mostly for company. The static crackled before giving way to the local station, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was 20 miles away with a girl who had never wanted me in her life until she had no one else to call. That's when I noticed it. The cassette tape still in the player. Martha's voice singing lullabies she had recorded for Elizabeth when she was small. For the nights when Mommy has to work late, she'd written on the label in her neat handwriting. I'd never removed it. Not even when the doctor said Martha had 6 months at best. Not even when those 6 months shrank to 3. Not even when Elizabeth stopped visiting her mother in the hospital, claiming her senior year commitments were just too important to miss. In the silence between Martha's songs and the engine's familiar groan, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. A note Martha had left me before she passed. It was still in the glove compartment, folded inside the car's original manual. I'd read it so many times I knew the words by heart. "Promise me you'll never stop seeing beauty in the small things, even if they don't see you." Those words hammered in my chest like a second heartbeat. Had I been wrong to keep my secret? To let the mockery slide off my back year after year? To watch Elizabeth grow from a resentful teenager into a woman who measured worth by price tags and social media validation? The windshield fogged up, and I wiped it with my sleeve. The highway stretched ahead, dark and slick with rain. Somewhere out there was a young woman who had spent her adult life being embarrassed by me, who had rolled her eyes when I showed up at her college graduation in my shabby clothes, who had seated me at the far table at her wedding, away from her fancy friends. And now she needed me. Not her successful husband, not her glamorous friends from the country club. Me, the man she called broke behind my back, and sometimes to my face. I pulled over at a gas station to clear my head. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped out into the rain. My reflection in the convenience store window caught me by surprise. When had I gotten so old? The gray hair, the deep lines around my eyes, the slight stoop in my shoulders. Martha would hardly recognize me now. As I pumped gas into the old Buick, I made a decision. Today wouldn't just be about rescuing Elizabeth. It would be about something much bigger. Something Martha and I had planned years ago, before cancer took her from us. A lesson that couldn't be taught with words alone. I got back on the road, rehearsing what I would say when I saw her. But in the end, when I finally spotted her figure huddled under the small awning of an abandoned farm stand, the baby clutched tightly to her chest, all my prepared speeches evaporated like the rain on my hood. Some lessons don't need words. Some truths have to be seen to be believed. When she saw me pulling up in the old Buick, Elizabeth's face fell. Even in her moment of desperate need, there was disappointment etched across her features, as if she'd been hoping someone else might answer her call. Someone with a nicer car, perhaps. Someone she wouldn't be embarrassed to be rescued by. The rain hadn't let up. It drummed against the roof of my car like impatient fingers. creating a symphony of metallic pings that filled the silence between us. I rolled down the window, raindrops immediately splashing onto the worn leather interior. "Get in," I said simply. She didn't respond. Not a word of gratitude, not even a nod of acknowledgement. She just ducked her head against the rain and hurried to the passenger side, clutching little Jacob tightly against her chest. The baby was bundled in what looked like an expensive cashmere blanket, now soaked through and probably ruined. His tiny face was red from crying, his miniature fists balled up in protest against the cold and wet. Elizabeth settled into the passenger seat, her designer jeans soaked to the knees, her once perfect hair now plastered to her forehead. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since she was 13 and Martha first got sick. "The car just died," she said, not looking at me. "Richard was supposed to have it serviced last month." I nodded, not mentioning that Richard was probably too busy servicing his relationship with his administrative assistant to worry about car maintenance. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto Route 50. The three of us, an unlikely trio, continued in silence, broken only by Jacob's occasional whimpers and the rhythmic swish of the old wipers struggling against the downpour. Through the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of Elizabeth's face. Her eyes were swollen, the carefully applied makeup now streaked down her cheeks in watery trails. But behind the tears, that familiar pride still lingered, that stubborn, chin-up defiance that had always reminded me so much of her mother. We drove past the turnoff to her gated community, the one with the man-made lake and the houses that all looked eerily similar despite their million-dollar price tags. She didn't ask why we weren't heading there. Perhaps she already knew that going back to the house she'd shared with Richard would be too painful. Or maybe she just didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, I took the familiar route to my home, the same modest, two-story house I'd lived in for over 4 decades. The maple tree in the front yard had grown so tall its branches now scraped against the upstairs windows during storms like this one. Martha had planted that tree the day we moved in, back when Elizabeth was just a toddler with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "Your room is still the same," I said as we pulled into the driveway. "I never changed it." Elizabeth glanced at me, surprise momentarily replacing the defeat in her eyes. She hadn't stayed in that room since high school, before the expensive boarding school, before the Ivy League college, before she became too good for holidays in our cramped house. But I didn't stop at the house. I kept driving, following the narrow gravel path that wound behind the property, deeper into the wooded area that had been part of the original parcel when Martha and I bought the place back in '82. Elizabeth sat up straighter, confusion evident in her voice. "Where are we going?" The trees thinned out, revealing a clearing I had maintained meticulously over the years. And there, nestled between 2 ancient oaks, stood the rusted iron gate that no one in the family knew existed. It was almost entirely concealed by strategically planted shrubs and climbing vines, a secret hiding in plain sight for decades. I parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, expectant. "What is this?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. I stepped out without answering, pulling my old raincoat tighter around me as I approached the gate. The padlock was stiff from disuse, the key turning reluctantly in the rusted mechanism. I hadn't opened this gate since 1996, the year Martha was first diagnosed, the year everything changed. Elizabeth watched from the car, Jacob now asleep against her chest, exhausted from his ordeal. Her eyes followed my every movement, curiosity temporarily overriding her practiced indifference. The lock finally gave way with a stubborn groan of surrender. I pushed the gate open, wincing at the harsh screech of metal against metal. Some things protest when disturbed after too long at rest. I turned back toward the car and gestured for Elizabeth to join me. She hesitated, looking down at the sleeping baby, then back at me. For a moment I thought she might refuse, that her pride might once again stand between us. But something had shifted. Perhaps it was the vulnerability of her situation. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first glimmer of understanding that there might be more to her stepfather than the shabby clothes and the outdated car. She emerged from the Buick slowly, using her body to shield Jacob from the worst of the rain. As she approached the gate, her eyes widened, peering beyond me into the darkness that concealed what I had kept hidden for more than 3 decades. "Dad?" she said. And in that single word, the one she had never used for me before, I heard the first crack in the wall between us. I reached for the light switch, my fingers finding it by memory despite the years. The fluorescents flickered reluctantly to life, humming and sputtering like they were waking from a long hibernation. Dust particles danced in the sudden brightness, swirling around us like microscopic snowflakes. Elizabeth gasped. There, beneath heavy canvas covers, stood the unmistakable silhouettes of 4 vehicles. Not just any vehicles. Their elegant, sweeping lines were impossible to mistake even under their shrouds. One of them still bore the inspection tag from its last restoration, untouched since 1996. My hands, weathered and spotted with age, trembled slightly as I approached the nearest one. I'd spent countless evenings here, all those years when Elizabeth and everyone else thought I was just puttering around in an old man's garage, doing nothing of value. "May I?" I asked, my hand hovering over the edge of the first cover. Elizabeth nodded, speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Jacob stirred against her chest but didn't wake. I pulled the heavy canvas back, revealing the gleaming red paint of a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTE. The overhead lights reflected off its immaculate surface like liquid fire. Next to it, under another cover, sat a 1971 Ferrari Dino, its yellow paint vibrant despite the years of darkness. The third was a 1985 Testarossa, white as fresh snow. And the fourth, my greatest treasure, a 1959 250 GT California Spider, one of only 56 ever made. "Are these yours?" Elizabeth's voice cracked, her designer purse slipping from her shoulder and landing with a soft thud on the concrete floor. "But how? Why? Why would you hide this?" The questions tumbled out, each one colliding with the next. The wall of superiority she'd built between us over the years began to crumble visibly, confusion replacing certainty in her eyes. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the small desk in the corner, Martha's old writing desk that I'd moved out here after she passed. From the drawer, I removed a manila envelope, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. Inside was a photograph, the last one taken of Martha and me together, and a letter. The photo showed us on our 20th anniversary, standing proudly beside the California Spider. Martha's smile was radiant despite the chemotherapy that had thinned her hair, forcing her to wear the colorful headscarf she had somehow made look elegant. My arm was around her waist, holding her up when her strength failed but making it look like a lover's embrace. I handed the envelope to Elizabeth, watching as she shifted Jacob to one arm so she could examine its contents. Her hands were shaking almost as much as mine. "Your mother wrote that," I said simply, nodding toward the letter. "She asked me to give it to you when the time was right." Elizabeth unfolded the letter carefully, as if it might disintegrate at her touch. Martha's handwriting flowed across the page, still vibrant despite the years, her personality evident in every loop and curve. "My dearest Elizabeth," she began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're reading this, it means you've finally seen beyond the old car. And if you're crying, Frank will know it's time. There are things about your stepfather you never understood, things I never explained properly before I left you both. The cars you see before you aren't just vehicles. They're the physical manifestation of a promise Frank made to me when we first met. He was already a respected restoration expert when I stumbled into his shop, a single mother with a leaky radiator and barely enough money for groceries. He fixed my car for free and asked for nothing in return except the chance to take us both to dinner. When we married, he sold his shop and took a regular job so he could be home every night to help raise you. The fancy restoration work became his side passion, something he did in stolen moments while you slept. Every car he restored and sold put money away for your future. Your education, your wedding, the safety net I feared I wouldn't be able to provide. The 4 cars he kept were special. Each one represents a milestone in our life together. The day we met, the day we married, the day you graduated high school, and the California Spider. That was meant to be his retirement, the nest egg that would allow him to finally live comfortably after a lifetime of sacrifice. But when my cancer returned, Frank didn't hesitate. He sold everything else, his tools, his parts collection, even his beloved workshop downtown, to pay for treatments the insurance wouldn't cover. Everything except these 4 cars, which I made him promise to keep. Not for their value, though they're worth millions now, but because they tell our story. A story of a man who never cared about appearances or recognition. A man who drove an old Buick while housing a fortune in his backyard because he understood that true worth isn't found in what others see, but in what we build when no one is looking. If you're standing in this garage, it means you finally needed him enough to see past the surface. And if you're crying, it means there's hope that you'll understand what I've always known. Frank Carter is the richest man I've ever met, because he measures wealth by love, not dollars. Love always, Mom. Elizabeth's legs gave way. She sank to her knees on the concrete floor, still clutching Jacob protectively against her chest, the letter trembling in her hand. Tears streamed freely down her face, carving glistening paths through her makeup. All this time, she whispered, her voice breaking. All those years I made fun of you, called you names, treated you like you were beneath me. I knelt beside her, my old knees protesting the movement. It was never about the cars, Elizabeth. I know that now, she said, and for the first time in decades she looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing beyond the shabby exterior to the man beneath. Mom knew, didn't she? She knew I'd need to hit rock bottom before I could understand. I nodded slowly. Your mother always saw things the rest of us missed. In that moment, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of automotive history, Elizabeth buried her face against my shoulder and sobbed, not for the revelation of hidden wealth, but for the decades of blindness that had cost her a relationship with the only father who had ever truly been there. Elizabeth's sobs gradually subsided into uneven breaths. Little Jacob, disturbed by the commotion, began to stir against her chest, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. I noticed his discomfort and gently touched Elizabeth's shoulder. Let's get you both inside. The baby needs to be warm and dry. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, smearing what remained of her expensive mascara. I helped her to her feet, surprised at how light she felt, as if the weight of her pride had been physically lifting her all these years. Hold him tight, I instructed, nodding toward Jacob. I need to get something from the car. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the metal roof of the garage. Through the open door, I could see my old Buick sitting faithfully where I'd left it, water streaming down its windshield like silent tears. I made my way to it, my shoes squelching against the wet gravel. Inside the car, I reached for the tape deck, that ancient piece of technology that Elizabeth and her friends had mocked relentlessly whenever they'd been forced to ride with me. Who even has cassettes anymore, she'd once asked, rolling her eyes at a friend in the backseat. It's like riding in a museum. My fingers found the eject button, stiff from disuse. The cassette slid out reluctantly, as if it too was hesitant to reveal its secrets after all this time. The label had faded, but Martha's handwriting was still visible. For my loves, when I'm not there. I returned to the garage where Elizabeth stood swaying gently, trying to soothe Jacob. The concrete floor was cold, the air musty with the scent of dormant machines and memories left undisturbed for too long. There's a small apartment attached to the back, I explained, leading her toward a door half hidden behind metal shelving. Martha insisted we build it when we first set up the garage. She said every man needs a place to escape sometimes. The apartment was simple. A studio with a kitchenette, bathroom, and a pull-out sofa that I'd slept on more times than I could count during those long nights of restoration work. The air was stale but clean. I'd maintained it meticulously, like everything else in my life. I switched on the space heater and the room began to warm immediately. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the sofa, looking around with new eyes at a space she'd never known existed, just yards from the house she'd grown up in. I'll get some towels and clothes, I said, turning to leave. No. Elizabeth's voice stopped me. Please, don't go yet. I hesitated, then nodded, settling into the worn armchair across from her. Jacob had calmed, his tiny eyelids drooping as exhaustion overcame him. What's that? Elizabeth asked, noticing the cassette in my hand. Something your mother made, I replied, my voice rough with emotions I'd kept contained for decades. I think it's time you heard it. In the corner of the room sat an old boombox, another relic from a bygone era. I crossed to it, blew off a thin layer of dust, and inserted the cassette. My finger hovered over the play button as I turned to Elizabeth. Are you sure you're ready for this? She nodded, her eyes fixed on the machine as if it were about to speak the words of a prophet. I pressed play. There was a moment of static, then Martha's voice filled the room. Strong, clear, without a trace of the pain that had marked her final months. It was her voice from before, when hope still outweighed fear, when our future still stretched before us like an open road. "If you're hearing this," she began, "it means the world has turned its back on you. But I want you to know that I haven't, and neither has Frank." Elizabeth's breath caught. She clutched Jacob tighter, as if her mother's voice might somehow disappear if she didn't hold on to something solid. "I'm recording this in the hospital while you're at cheer practice," Martha continued. "The doctors say, well, you know what they say by now. But that's not important. What's important is what I didn't say when I had the chance." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. I remembered that day, sitting beside her hospital bed, watching her organize her thoughts, determined to leave nothing unsaid. "Elizabeth, my beautiful, stubborn daughter, you have always wanted to fit in with people who have more than we do. I understand that. I was the same at your age. But there's something you need to know about the man who raised you, the man you've been pushing away since you were 13. Elizabeth's eyes found mine across the room, wide with a new understanding that was still forming, still taking shape. "You don't need to love him," Martha's voice continued, firm now, maternal, "but respect his silence. Because every wrinkle you laugh at, every gray hair you mock, every threadbare shirt you're embarrassed by, each one represents a choice he made so you would never go without." Martha's voice broke slightly, and I remembered how she'd paused at this point, taken a sip of water, squeezed my hand before continuing. "When your biological father abandoned us, Frank didn't just take us in, he rebuilt our world. He worked 2 jobs so you could have dance lessons. He drove that old car so you could have new clothes for school. He gave up his dreams so you could chase yours." Elizabeth's tears had returned, silent now, sliding down her cheeks and falling onto Jacob's blanket. The baby slept on, oblivious to the decades of pain being lanced open in that small room. "I won't be there to see the woman you become," Martha said, her voice softening. "But Frank will. And my greatest fear isn't dying. It's that you'll never see him for who he truly is until it's too late for both of you." The tape continued, but Elizabeth had covered her ears, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I moved to stop it, but she shook her head violently. "No," she managed. "I need to hear it all." And so we sat, 3 generations connected by a voice from the past as Martha's final message played on. A bridge across time, connecting the people she had loved most in the world. When the tape finally clicked to a stop, the silence that filled the room was different than before. Not empty, but full. Full of understanding. Full of regret. Full of possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Forgive me, Dad," Elizabeth whispered, the title no longer forced or foreign on her lips. For the first time since Martha's funeral, she reached for my hand. The night settled around us like a heavy blanket. Jacob was finally sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bassinet I'd created from an old drawer lined with soft towels. The same drawer where I once kept Martha's hand-knitted baby blankets, preserved all these years like sacred relics. Elizabeth sat at the small kitchenette table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Her face, stripped of makeup and pretense, looked younger somehow, more like the girl I remembered from before designer labels became her armor, before status became her religion. "There's something else you should see," I said quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. At the far end of the garage, behind the row of gleaming Ferraris, stood an old wooden workbench. It had been my father's before me. Solid oak with a vice grip on one end and decades of nicks and stains mapping out a lifetime of projects. I knelt down with some difficulty. My knees weren't what they used to be, and reached underneath, feeling for the hidden compartment I'd built when Martha first got sick. My fingers found the small brass latch, disguised as just another imperfection in the aged wood. It released with a soft click, and the bottom panel of the workbench swung open. Inside was a wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, secured with a small padlock. I carried it back to Elizabeth, the weight of it familiar in my hands. How many nights had I sat alone, turning this box over and over, debating whether the time had come? How many times had I nearly driven to her house only to turn around at the last minute? Martha's words echoing in my mind. "She'll know when she's ready, not before." "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Your mother's official will," I replied, setting the box on the table between us. "The one that was never filed with the lawyers." Her eyes widened. "I don't understand. We went through her will after the funeral. The house went to you, her personal belongings to me. It was all very straightforward." I nodded, remembering that day at the attorney's office. Elizabeth in a black designer suit checking her watch every few minutes, eager to get back to her college dorm and the life that was already carrying her away from us. That was the public will, I explained, producing a small key from my wallet. This is the one she asked me to keep private until… I hesitated. Until what? Elizabeth prompted. Until you saw with your own eyes, I finished, unlocking the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a legal document bound with a ribbon that had once been red, but had faded to a dusty pink. On top was a smaller envelope with Elizabeth's name written in Martha's elegant script. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. The paper crackled as she opened it, brittle with age. She began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. My dearest Elizabeth, if you're reading this, then Frank has finally shown you the garage, and more importantly, you've finally been ready to see it. This isn't easy for me to write, knowing I won't be there to guide you through the woman you're becoming. But some lessons can only be learned through experience, no matter how much a mother wishes to spare her child the pain. The document enclosed is my true final will and testament. In it, I've left everything. The house, the cars, even the proceeds from any sales to you. But there's a condition that Frank has promised to honor. You receive this inheritance only when you learn to recognize the value of things that can't be seen or touched. I know how that sounds, like some fairy tale moral designed to teach a child a lesson. But you're not a child anymore. And this isn't a fairy tale. It's about understanding that worth isn't measured in dollars or appearances. Frank could have sold those cars years ago. He could have moved to a bigger house, driven a newer car, worn expensive clothes. He had the means. What he lacked was the desire, because he understood something that took me years to learn. When you measure your value by others' perceptions, you'll always feel poor. I'm sorry I won't see your wedding or hold my grandchildren. I'm sorry I won't be there to help you through your first heartbreak or celebrate your successes. But I'm not sorry for marrying Frank, or for asking him to keep this secret until you were ready. Some treasures are meant to be discovered, not given. Some truths have to be earned. All my love, Mom. Elizabeth carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. When she looked up, her eyes held a question. Why now? She asked. After all these years, all the horrible things I said to you, all the times I embarrassed you in front of others, why would you still honor her wishes? Why not just sell everything and enjoy your life? I considered her question, turning it over in my mind like an old coin. Outside, the rain had stopped and moonlight filtered through the small window, casting silver shadows across the concrete floor. Because I made a promise, I said simply, not just to your mother, but to myself, and because some things are worth waiting for. I opened the will, the legal language dense and formal on the yellowed pages. It was exactly as Martha had described. Everything would go to Elizabeth, with me as the trustee until certain conditions were met. You could have left me stranded on that highway, Elizabeth said, her voice catching. After the way I've treated you all these years, no one would have blamed you. I reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had once been so small it could barely wrap around my thumb, the same hand that had pushed me away so many times I'd lost count. That's not who I am, I replied, and it's not who your mother raised you to be either. Elizabeth's gaze dropped to the will, then to the sleeping form of her son. In the soft light I could see Martha in the curve of her jaw, the arch of her eyebrows, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when deep in thought. What happens now? She asked, suddenly sounding very young. I closed the wooden box carefully, the latch making a soft click that seemed to punctuate the moment. That, I said, is entirely up to you. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the small window of the garage apartment. I'd slept in the armchair, my back protesting the arrangement with familiar aches and stiffness. Elizabeth had taken the pull-out sofa, curled protectively around Jacob, who, miraculously, had slept through most of the night. I watched them for a moment, this unexpected tableau of my stepdaughter and grandson in a place I'd kept private for so long. Elizabeth's face in sleep was softer, the hard lines of judgment and superiority erased by unconsciousness. She looked more like the little girl I remembered, the one who used to climb into my lap with picture books before Martha got sick, before the world taught her that worth was measured by brand names and bank accounts. Jacob stirred first, his tiny face scrunching up as he registered hunger or discomfort. His whimpers were soft at first, then gradually more insistent. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, immediately alert in the way of new mothers. She sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. "Good morning," I said quietly, standing up to put on a pot of coffee. My joints popped in protest as I moved around the small kitchenette. Elizabeth nodded, still half asleep, her attention focused on soothing Jacob. "Do you have anything I could feed him?" I didn't bring any formula. I wasn't planning to be gone so long. "There's a convenience store about a mile down the road," I replied. "I can go pick up some supplies." She glanced out the window at the brightening sky. "No, I should go. I need to figure things out, make some calls." A flash of pain crossed her face as she presumably thought of Richard and his betrayal. "I can't hide out here forever." I didn't argue. Some journeys you can't make for another person, no matter how much you might want to. I handed her my car keys instead. "Take the Buick," I said. "It's not much to look at, but it'll get you there and back." Elizabeth took the keys, their familiar leather fob worn smooth by decades of handling. Her fingers closed around them hesitantly, as if she were accepting something far more significant than temporary transportation. After feeding Jacob with the emergency formula I kept in the pantry, a habit from when Elizabeth's cousins would visit with their children, she gathered her few belongings and prepared to leave. She'd borrowed one of my flannel shirts to replace her rain-soaked blouse, a garment she would have been mortified to be seen in just 24 hours earlier. "I'll be back in an hour," she promised, strapping Jacob into a makeshift carrier fashioned from a soft blanket. "Just need to get some supplies and clear my head." I nodded, understanding the unspoken need for space, for time to process everything that had been revealed. "The keys can be tricky," I warned. "You have to jiggle them a bit and pump the gas twice before turning the ignition." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I remember. You taught me that when I was learning to drive." The memory hit me with unexpected force. 16-year-old Elizabeth, nervous and excited, grinding the gears of the old Buick as I patiently explained the clutch. Before designer purses and private schools. Before she started introducing me as my mom's husband instead of my dad. I watched from the doorway as she made her way to the car, carefully settling Jacob in the back seat. The morning sun glinted off the Buick's faded paint, highlighting every scratch and dent, a roadmap of a life lived without pretense. Elizabeth slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, another habit I'd taught her, and inserted the key. I heard the familiar sound of metal against metal, then the click as she turned the ignition. Nothing happened. She tried again, this time pumping the gas pedal as instructed. The engine coughed weakly but didn't catch. A third attempt. A fourth. Each time the old car protested with diminishing energy, like an elderly patient whose heart was finally giving out after years of faithful service. From where I stood, I could see Elizabeth's shoulders begin to shake. At first, I thought she was crying from frustration, the final indignity in a day filled with revelations and emotional upheaval. But as I approached, I realized she wasn't crying at all. She was laughing. It wasn't her usual laugh, the practiced, performative sound she used at family gatherings. This was something raw and genuine, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the steering wheel, her body trembling with laughter that gradually shifted into something else. Not quite sobs, but close. I opened the passenger door and slid in beside her, the familiar scent of old leather and the pine air freshener that had hung from the rearview mirror for as long as either of us could remember, enveloping us like a cocoon. "It won't start," she said unnecessarily, her voice breaking. "No," I agreed. "I think it's finally had enough." Elizabeth ran her hands over the steering wheel, her fingers tracing the cracks in the worn leather, caressing it like she was apologizing to an old friend. "All those years," she whispered. "All those times I made fun of this car, called it a piece of junk, refused to be seen in it." I remained silent, letting her work through the realization at her own pace. "But it was never about the car, was it?" she continued, her eyes finding mine. "It was about memories, about sacrifice, about everything I thought I knew but never saw." She leaned back in the seat, gazing at the faded ceiling fabric that sagged slightly in the center. I was so focused on what other people might think of me, I never stopped to think about what I'd become. From the back seat, Jacob made a soft cooing sound, as if offering his own commentary on his mother's epiphany. Elizabeth turned to look at her son, then back to me. Without warning, she leaned across the center console and embraced me. Not the stiff, obligatory hug of recent years, but the fierce, desperate embrace of a child finding her way home after a long absence. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against my shoulder, her tears dampening my shirt. "I'm so sorry." I held her, This grown woman who had once been the little girl I'd raised as my own, and felt something long broken begin to mend. "It's okay," I said, my own voice rough with emotion. "It's okay." And in that moment, sitting in a car that wouldn't start, I felt my wife's presence stronger than I had in years, as if she'd engineered this entire scenario from whatever place she now watched over us. Elizabeth finally pulled away, wiping her eyes. "What do we do now?" I smiled, reaching for my phone. "We call a tow truck, and then if you're willing, we take a different car to the store." Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You mean?" I nodded. "I think it's time the California Spider saw some sunlight, don't you? That was 6 months ago. Today, Elizabeth drives the old Buick with a kind of pride I never expected to see. After the tow truck came that morning, I had the engine rebuilt. Not because we needed the car, but because some things deserve a second chance. Just like people. The mechanic, Joey Townsend, couldn't believe I was putting money into that old beater when he'd seen me driving the California Spider around town. "You could buy 10 new cars for what that Ferrari's worth," he'd said, shaking his head as he wrote up the estimate for the Buick's repairs. I just smiled. Some things can't be explained to people who measure value only in dollars and cents. Elizabeth moved into the guest room of my house that same week. At first, she said it was temporary, just until she sorted things out with Richard. But as days turned into weeks and temporary custody arrangements became permanent divorce proceedings, we both knew she wasn't going anywhere. The house feels different now, alive in a way it hasn't been since Martha passed. The sound of Jacob's laughter echoes through rooms that have been silent for too long. Toys litter the living room floor. The refrigerator door is covered with shopping lists and baby pictures instead of just unpaid bills and doctor's appointment reminders. On quiet evenings after Jacob is asleep, Elizabeth and I sit on the porch swing, the one Martha and I used to share, and talk about things we should have discussed years ago. Her childhood, her mother's illness, the wall she built between us as a teenager, the regrets that haunt us both. "I was so horrible to you," she said one night, her voice small in the darkness. "All those years, all those holidays where I deliberately made you feel small. How do you not hate me?" I considered my answer carefully, watching fireflies blink in the yard, nature's own slow-motion light show. "Hate takes too much energy," I finally replied. "And energy was something I couldn't spare while raising you and taking care of your mother." She was quiet for a long time after that, the swing creaking gently beneath us. "You know what I remember most?" she eventually asked. "Not the big moments, not the birthdays or Christmases. I remember you teaching me to tie my shoes, how patient you were even when I got frustrated and threw the shoes across the room." I chuckled. "You had quite an arm for a 5-year-old. You never raised your voice," she continued. "Not once, even when I deserved it." "That's not how I was raised," I said simply. "And it's not how I wanted to raise you." The conversation faded into comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have moved beyond the need to fill every quiet moment with words. That's how most of our evenings go now. Simple, quiet, healing. During the days, Elizabeth has started helping me with the car restorations. She's surprisingly good at it, detail-oriented and patient in a way I never saw when she was younger. Jacob sits in his playpen in the corner of the garage, fascinated by the tools and the sounds of our work. "Do you think he'll remember any of this when he's older?" Elizabeth asked me once, watching her son drift off to sleep amid the gentle clanking of wrenches and the soft hum of the radio. "Maybe not the details," I answered, "but he'll remember the feeling. Children always do." Last weekend, we took the California Spider to a car show in Bennington. It won first prize. Not surprising for a vehicle of its pedigree and condition. What was surprising was Elizabeth's reaction. Instead of basking in the attention the car attracted, she spent most of the day telling people about me, about how I'd restored it, about my knowledge of vintage Ferraris, about the craftsmanship that went into every detail. "That's my dad," she kept saying, with a kind of fierce pride that made my heart constrict every time I overheard it. "He's the best restoration expert on the East Coast." On the drive home, with the trophy sitting on the back seat and Jacob asleep in his car seat, specially installed in a Ferrari for perhaps the first time in automotive history, Elizabeth turned to me. "You know what I realized today?" she asked, her voice nearly lost beneath the purr of the engine. "I spent my whole life wanting people to envy me for what I had. But now, for the first time, I'm proud of who I am." I reached across the gearshift and squeezed her hand, unable to find words adequate for the moment. When we got home, Elizabeth insisted on parking the Buick in the driveway, leaving the Ferrari in the garage under its cover. "This is our everyday car now," she declared. "No more hiding who we are or what matters to us." The next morning she called her former colleagues at the marketing firm, the same people she'd spent years trying to impress with designer labels and status symbols, and invited them over for a barbecue. "Dress casual," she told them. "We're not those people anymore." They came, curious about the new Elizabeth. She greeted them wearing jeans and one of my old flannel shirts, Jacob balanced on her hip. She showed them the garage, told them the whole story without embellishment or shame. Some seemed uncomfortable with her newfound authenticity. Others were visibly moved. One of her former friends, a woman who'd always been the first to show off new jewelry or brag about exotic vacations, pulled me aside. "You know," she said quietly, "I always envied her perfect life. Now I envy her for an entirely different reason." Yesterday, Elizabeth asked if she could take the Buick to visit her father, her biological father, who she hasn't spoken to in nearly a decade. "There are some things I need to say to him," she explained. "Some bridges that need mending, even if they can never be fully repaired." I handed her the keys without question. Some journeys you have to make alone. Before she left, I slipped an envelope onto the passenger seat of the Buick. My own letter to add to the collection that had changed both our lives. It wasn't eloquent like Martha's, just a few simple lines that summed up everything I've learned in my 73 years. It doesn't matter what others see in you. What matters is what you see when no one is looking. That's where true love lives. She called me from the road, crying so hard I could barely make out her words. "I found your letter," she managed finally. "I don't deserve any of this. Your forgiveness, your love, this second chance. That's the thing about love," I told her. "It's never about deserving. It's about choosing every day to see beyond the surface. Your mother taught me that. Now I'm teaching you." When she pulled into the driveway that evening, her eyes were red but peaceful. She didn't tell me what happened with her father, and I didn't ask. Some stories take time to be ready for telling. Instead, she handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a keychain. Nothing fancy, just a simple leather strap with a small medallion attached. Engraved on one side were 3 words: worth, value, love. On the other side, Dad's keys. It now holds the keys to both the Buick and the California Spider. 2 cars that couldn't be more different on the surface, but when you look deeper, at the care that went into maintaining them, at the journeys they've witnessed, at the lives they've touched, they're not so different after all. Kind of like people that way. Life has a way of teaching us the hardest lessons when we least expect them. For years, I allowed my stepdaughter to mock me, to see only what she wanted to see. An old man with an old car. I could have revealed my secret at any time, could have silenced her ridicule with the turn of a key. But sometimes wisdom isn't about proving others wrong. It's about waiting patiently for them to discover what's right. What would you have done in my place? Would you have had the strength to endure years of mockery when you could have easily proven your worth? Or would you, like me, understand that true value isn't found in what others see, but in what we see when no one is looking? Perhaps the greatest wealth we can possess isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the capacity to love unconditionally, even when that love isn't returned. If this story touched your heart today, remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. The person you mock for their appearance might be sacrificing everything for someone they love. The broke dad in the old car might be richer than you'll ever know. Share this video with someone who needs this reminder. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden treasures in ordinary lives. And let me know in the comments, what's the most valuable lesson you've learned about true worth?